G'day, it's Jack Whelan here, barrister, mediator, and I'm delighted to be in Newcastle for podcast number 5 with Tarnya Davis, clinical and forensic psychologist with NewPsych. Tarnya, wonderful to see you, and thank you so much for being a part of the Separation Guide Network in Newcastle.
I'm really excited about it.
Thank you. Now, Tarnya, today we're going to talk about the sorts of feelings and emotions, challenges that people are going through when they are separating and divorcing, and in particular how that can affect children who are going through this as well. Obviously, it's not just a couple who are going through separation and divorce, often it's children who are going through it as well. So the first question is, how can parents separating or divorcing make children feel? And how are children coping with this very difficult time in the lives of their family?
Well, I guess a separation is probably one of the potentially most traumatic and difficult times a family might go through. When you decide to choose a partner and stay with them, most people kind of think it's going to be forever, and when it doesn't turn out that way, as you said, it's like hugely emotional. It wasn't supposed to be this way. And so there's often a lot of hurt and disappointment and grief and loss that each parent is feeling, each partner is feeling. But I think the important thing to remember is that although you may not be a couple anymore forever, you're the parents of those kids. And it's really important to understand that although you're approaching this separation with an adult's mind and an adult's perspective, for kids, it's huge. Their families, is supposed to be their safe place. So at many levels, and we see a lot of adults still coming into counselling, and some of what they're dealing with is that how their parents separated when they were kids, really? And the impact of that upon them. I think one of the main things that kids need from their parents is attachment, which virtually means I create a safe place for you and I hear you, you're important, I'm available to you, and also I teach you how to manage your feelings, but also you look to me as to how to manage difficult feelings myself. And so a big part of what kids see and learn is how their parents might manage their difficult emotions around the separation.
So children will grieve, in a sense, will they, for the family unit which they had anticipated would be permanent.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that grief certainly might continue right into their adult life. But it might be a grief for the family that they wished that they'd have had. But it's not always black and white. I mean, sometimes for kids living in a situation where there's been conflict, the evidence says that for kids, once the separation has occurred, if there's no longer any enduring conflict, then they're much better off than having to live in a situation where there's a lot of ongoing conflict and obviously violence. So in those situations, kids are much better off with parents that are separated and that they're able to be safe. But it's also important to understand that the kids still deserve to have a relationship with both parents.
So, Tarnya, in respect of that attachment, which is a word that you used before, it's counterintuitive in a sense, isn't it? Because there's obviously a break, there's a separation. But in respect of both parents being able to still provide that level of attachment, what's your advice to parents who might need advice to how to construct that attachment in the context of a separation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we probably don't have the time to talk about where kids are unsafe if there's domestic violence or sexual abuse. So if we exclude that group and we're talking about kids that still have the right to have a relationship with both parents,
Sure, and Tony, just on that for our listeners, on our site, on the Separation Guide site, there is, of course, reference to all of those sorts of services being available. And it is important, plainly, if there is domestic violence or violence in the household, those services are accessed. So, as you say, in circumstances where that is the case, people should be accessing those services. In circumstances where they're not, please continue. How do parents construct those relationships in that separation?
Yeah, I think it's important that both parents are on board with understanding that the child has a right to have a relationship with both parents. You know, if your partner's hurt you and disappointed you and things hadn't turned out as you had hoped, that shouldn't get in the way of the child still maintaining a relationship with that other parent. And so perhaps a starting point needs to be a respectfulness and a fostering of that relationship with the other parent, and how that looks might be in how you speak about the other parent, the kind of information you might share about the conflict that you have with that parent, being mindful of the impact of that upon the child. Sometimes kids will take on the emotional pain of their parent, and they become parentified in a way, wanting to make sure that mum's feeling okay or dad's feeling okay, when ideally that's not what childhood should be about. Childhood should be about the kids. And so perhaps making sure that relationship continues starts with how you speak about the other parent, encouraging time with the other parent, and letting the child know, do you know what, it's okay with me for you to go to dad or you to go to mum and have a good time with them, that's okay, and I'll still be here and I'll be okay while you're away, and I'll be looking forward to you coming back. Sending those kind of healthy messages, I think, is a really important part of making sure the child feels like they have permission to still love dad or love mum or enjoy time with dad or enjoy time with mum, or whichever combination it might happen to be.
Putting the child first and being able to agree on those rules between the parents, and whether that be respectful dialogue or even just in principle that we are going to put our child or our children first, that can be a hard thing to do when people are hurt, angry. What's your advice to people who might intrinsically know that they need to do that, but it's very hard? How do they cross that bridge? Because plainly it is in the benefit, obviously speaking in fairly general terms, plainly it is in the benefit of children for there not to be that high level of conflict, have equal time and so forth, or the appropriate time with parents so their needs are met. But in many cases it must be harder to do than it is to say.
Of course it is. Yeah, of course it is. It's really tricky. You know, if we're talking about threat and the most difficult thing that you've been through, and talking about the separation itself falling into that category, then the idea that there might be some pain and suffering that comes to your child for having time with the other parent, for example, or them being away from you and you worrying about how that will affect your relationship with your child, that's even a higher threat for people. So the idea that this is going to be difficult for their kids is really highly emotional. And I talked about attachment before. That's where we learn in our childhood how to manage our emotions and regulate our emotions. That's what we do as adults when we're going through a really difficult time. So some of the challenge is, as you say, how do you stay calm? How do you settle yourself? How do you manage to accept the situation for what it is and still kind of wish the best for your children? And it isn't easy, you know. We feel angry, but quite often, as what's the saying, resentment is like drinking poison and hoping the other person will die. What actually happens is resentment affects you, but then also to understand that resentment is affecting your children as well. So this is the idea of radical acceptance that we use in therapy that says sometimes when something's not fair or it's unjust or it's wrong, then we have that situation and then we feel really, really upset about that situation, even when we can't change it. Sometimes if we can't change something that we think is unfair, then we have a second problem. Like the first arrow is the injustice. The second arrow is the impact of that emotional pain upon us. If you can change a situation, if something can be fixed, negotiated, mediated, then fix that. But if it can't be changed, continuing to rally against that only just causes you more emotional pain and suffering. And the idea of radical acceptance is accepting it is what it is. This situation is what it is. We're separated. My kids are having time with the other parent. The other parent started another family. And all that isn't fair, but it is what it is. I can't change that. By accepting that, then perhaps I can learn to soothe myself, settle myself. And when my emotions are unchecked, and that's in fact the greatest gift I can give my children in this situation.
Well, when you speak to people about these things and about these, in many ways, sort of recognition of their own behaviours and how to change and so forth, it must take people in many cases time to be able to achieve that radical acceptance and then to modify behaviours. Is that true? Does it tend to take people time to kind of figure out what is the best way, the best behaviour to model for the benefit of their children? I know in my world of mediating these sorts of disputes, a person who you see at the start, who might be contemplating litigation, for example, and is full of rage and anger, can be a very different person a year down the track. There must be some benefit in kind of accelerating that personal growth, given what's at stake. I just wonder, how long does it tend to take people to kind of figure these things out? Again, it's obviously entirely case specific.
That's such a useful comment because I guess there's some kind of average of period of time of the shock and coming to terms with, this is what I've lost and the grief side of the change. And obviously there's huge social, financial changes, losing your partner and sometimes their extended family and having to move and changing your work situation, a whole lot of changes. And then after a period of time, for some people it may settle. But we would both know families who 5, 10, 30 years down the track are still, the child's getting married and can't have mum and dad at the same event. Sometimes the pain of that, in fact, doesn't ever settle. Those people choose to continue to hold on to those feelings of resentment and pain and injustice and suffering. So there will be people that choose never to let go of that, choose never to come to a place of acceptance, but their life is far more difficult. They've got that double arrow that I was talking about before. They've got twice the pain to deal with over that period of time. But to come to that place earlier obviously is much better for each of the partners, but certainly much better for the children, for that to settle sooner. And I think sometimes an influencing factor is who you choose to share with and who you choose to be on your side. I think if you're choosing to go to a legal professional or maybe even a therapist, or if you're telling your friends who are fueling your sense of that's unfair and you need to fight that and et cetera, then I think that can continue people in that place of being warring and being angry and taking it longer to come to the time when it does return to being about what's best for the kids.
Is it possible to do both? That is to say, is it possible to keep that grudge and sort of maintain that rage in relation to your partner. I'm not talking about physical rage, of course, but that anger and that hurt and that guilt, and perhaps it manifests in silence. Who knows? But can you exhibit those behaviours and not have that amicability, yet still provide the children with what they need? Because it seems to me that will often be the case depending on what stage of the journey people are at. I'm interested in your views on that.
Yeah. As long as they choose to foster the child's relationship with the other parent, it's when their rage and resentment seeps out into how they talk about the other parent, or the subtle or not so subtle ways they may denigrate them. That's when it's not providing what the child needs. And sometimes, people will say, well, the kids don't want to go to that parent's house. And sometimes that may be the case, but also sometimes that might be about the child feeling like they need to take care of their parents' emotional needs rather than their own.
So in those circumstances, it's likely that children will pick up on actually what's going on. Can it be the case that children in the context of separation can in effect be weaponised, and one parent using the children against the other? Does that happen? And if that's happening, and say for example, this is a very tough question without notice, Tarnya, and say that's happening, say the grandparents who are observing it, for example, what can those other parties do? You've spoken about being mindful not to escalate where it's inappropriate to do so. How can other parties assist in de-escalating if they have a view that might be necessary when they are talking to their friend or their child or brother or sister or whoever it might be?
That's a huge question. I'd like to think that that parents aren't consciously, as you say, weaponizing. I think that they genuinely, that's what being a parent is. Parents, I think, virtually always love their kids and want the best for them. And with a high level of emotion at a time of a separation, they, in fact, feel that what's best for the child is maybe not time with the other parent or more time with them, or fostering that relationship with them, for example. So I don't think it's out of any intention to cause harm for their children. I think they genuinely believe that this is what's best, and they, in fact, at the same time might genuinely believe that the other parent wants to undermine their relationship with the child. So I think the conflict accidentally finds itself that way, and impacting upon the kids. It's a tricky. So are you saying if you know someone who perhaps is having a skewed perception of what's best for the kids and not seeing the other parent's perspective, oh gosh, the world is so full of those situations, aren't there, where it's really difficult to be able to say to someone, do you know what, like maybe there's another story here. And sometimes it feels like you're being the best support for the person by agreeing with what they say. I think it just takes courage to be able to...
Not cheerlead.
Yeah, not cheerlead. To be able to say, I can see you're so distressed, this situation's so difficult. What do you think is going to be best for the children, and the evidence is, as I touched on before, if kids are in a high conflict family environment, and that conflict might, as you say, look like not speaking to each other for 6 months at a time, and then that ends with the separation, kids are better off. But kids where the conflict continues, or there's evidently more conflict even than before after separation, those kids are worse off. So it's really the amount of conflict that kids are exposed to that has a long-term impact. So maybe that's what grandparents can talk about. Maybe they can be saying, or friends can be saying, like, this is really tough and I can see they've hurt you and you're feeling really hurt and you're wanting the best for the kids. Can really see that, but this situation keeps, nothing's changing, no one's budging. What do you think you might be able to do that might de-escalate this so that it settles more for the kids? It definitely is tricky though.
It's one of those examples whereby, in a very practical sense, I've seen it myself, where, for example, the parents can turn up to watch Saturday morning football and on opposite sides of the field, and you often wonder about the impact of that on children, for example. Perhaps a practical way to frame the question is to ask, what do kids really need? They need attachment, preferably not being in a conflict environment, parents to speak well of each other where they can. What other practical things do children need, Tarnya, which people who are listening to the podcast may be able to start thinking about or indeed modelling if they need to?
So I think that the evidence says that kids need time with both parents, an appropriate time, and that varies dependent upon the age of the child. So they need perhaps more frequent visits when children are younger to form that attachment, and quality time, as we're talking about. And I think as well the evidence is shifting towards seeing that kids need somewhere that they call their home. There was a time when, equal time was considered what was best, but equal time seemed to be more about what suited the parents at that time and wanted to feel like they were sharing it equally. But the consequence for the kids was that perhaps there was no way that was their predominant home. And so I think we're starting to move away from that idea and more towards understanding kids' need for safety and security, the attachment that comes with the relationship with both parents, that ability for them not to take on their parents' problems as theirs, that they don't have to fix it. Fostering relationships with siblings is really important as well, and extended family too. And validation, I think, for both parents to be able to say, have the space to hear what their child's experience is and not to take it personally. It's not about them, but just to acknowledge and validate their child's experience of whatever it might be, and also to understand that it's going to change as they grow older, as they start spending more time with their friends, etc., that their time with each parent might change as well. So it needs to be a little bit of an adaptable model too, but always making time to send the child a message. Do you know what? Mum and dad aren't in a relationship anymore, but that was not your fault, because kids usually kids virtually always think it's their fault.
Really?
And to send them a message, it's not their fault, and that it's okay that they're completely loved no matter what, and that it's normal to have a whole range of emotional reactions with regards to this, and that's okay, and you'll be loved no matter what, and that it's okay to love the other parent too. Yeah.
So kids can feel guilty. They can feel as if what's happening to their parents might be their fault.
Yeah, certainly. It depends on the developmental age, but certainly young children, even if it's nothing to do with them, will think that it's something that they've done that meant that mum and dad didn't love each other enough to stay together for me.
That's the equation. That's how
it's very sad.
Sad and very revealing. So, Tarnya, if there are parents listening to this who are thinking about how they broach the subject. They've decided they're going to separate or divorce, and they're thinking about having a very difficult conversation with their child or children. What are the sorts of things they should practically think about? Is it the sort of conversation that you need to rehearse? Is it the sort of conversation that you need to practice with each other first? Is it a conversation that you have with the children together or separately? And again, it's very case specific. But I think any insights that you could offer would be very valuable, because it's got to be one of the toughest conversations for anyone to have to ever have.
Yeah, it is. And quite often we have parents come to see a psychologist together
Really?
to talk about, how do we broach this? What words should we put to this? How do we manage it?
Yeah. That seems a very responsible thing to do.
Yeah.
A very wise investment to do that, to reach out and seek that sort of skill building, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think it starts the parents being both on the same page of the words that they're going to choose and what they're going to choose to share with the kids. And it'll be a different conversation dependent upon the developmental age. And so it's probably worth, if you're not going to go and see a psychologist, it's probably worth sort of having a look on the internet for some reliable sources that might give you some information for the age that the child is.
Yep.
It's important to be able to manage your own emotional reactions in the situation. It's okay to be sad and to tell the children that you're feeling sad and upset and acknowledge the emotional part of that, but to keep it so that it allows space for the kids and any questions that they might have, and not to make it rushed, and to give them lots of space to answer any questions that they might have. They'll want to know, the parents okay? They'll want to know where they'll be living. They'll want to know how this is going to affect their lives. And it's not we've told you, so now let's move on. It's an enduring conversation to check in over the coming days, weeks and months. So, how are you feeling about that now? Any other questions that you might have? Understand that as they grow older, things might come up for them that they want to know more information or they want to question a bit more as the developmental age changes. So, again, it's just understanding that it's not right, we've done that, tick that off, that's it, and just kind of reassuring them as well as they can that they're loved and that it wasn't their fault, I think is really important. And really to think, okay, so how much of this story of what's happened to us needs to be their story? Do we keep the adult stuff to ourselves about affairs or whatever else it might be that the problem is, daddy's drinking and mum's gambling or whatever it might be? Or can we just say, it didn't work out and we're very sad that it didn't work out, but we both still love you, and we're both going to be in your life, and just talking about that.
That feels like, I hesitate to say a conversation, but it's a dialogue over a longer period of time rather than just that one conversation. But that feels like dialogue that to be done well would require some preparation, and even planning for what happens next after that dialogue, because presumably the children will have a reaction to it and think about it and stew on things as those little minds do. Investing in that preparation, it must be a good idea, especially given, as you mentioned at the start of the discussion, that people can hang on to these issues for a very, very long time, the rest of their lives.
Yeah. I think you really encapsulated the important part, that it's not a set and forget. It's an enduring conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation that you have with people. And there's a couples therapist who says, Stan Tatkin, his name is, and it may be too late for your listeners to engage in Stan Tatkin, but he's a great therapist, and he says, from a neurobiological perspective, when we first, as a couple, when you first say hello to each other at the end of the day, how you how you connect at that time determines how the rest of the night will go. So if you take the time to say, how was your day, and hug and say hello, that kind of thing, even just for a minute or two, then neurobiologically your brains and nervous systems are connected, and then you can move on and things will be much smoother. And in a way, that conversation that we're just talking about is a little bit like that. If people can work, even though how emotionally hard it is at that moment to sit in the room next to the person that's hurt you, or you know, you're feeling so angry and resentful, but if you can manage that for the benefit of the kids and realign yourself as, or continue that relationship as parents, no longer as a couple, but as parents, then perhaps that then sets the tone for how things will move on from there. If you can manage that moment, perhaps it's a sign that you'll be able to manage other moments as they come up.
Is that something which can get easier the more often you do it? It would be a difficult thing to do if someone is grieving or particularly angry. Is it something which, if you've done it once and perhaps see the benefit that that had to the night in question or to the kids or the way they were feeling about it all, I suppose my question is that behaviour ultimately rewarded as opposed to the alternative, which would be to say, blow up the evening, metaphorically speaking?
I think by the time you've separated, you've already accepted the fact that there's very little that you can do to influence the behaviour or attitude of another person. The only thing that you have control over is how you think, how you react, how you behave. And sometimes it takes a while for us to come to that place. But accepting that that's the thing you have control over, and understanding if you change your thinking towards the other person, even if they're continuing to be difficult and it feels like they're intentionally throwing poison your way, if you can manage your own emotion and settle yourself and almost have compassion for their suffering, which is a long step to take, but if you can say, their distress is their distress, and I feel for their distress, but I'm settling myself and managing my own reactions and learning to deal with this difficult situation by soothing myself and being contained, then sometimes that change results in the change to come. But continuing to continuing to hope that the other person will change, and then once they change, this will all be better, is unlikely to succeed, and that's where people get stuck. And then sometimes that's where the legal system kind of perpetuates that, because there's someone cheerleading your indignation at the other person, and they've got someone cheerleading their indignation at you, and it just keeps kind of throwing fuel on the fire.
Yeah, and fuel which can be very expensive financially and emotionally as well. Tarnya, absolutely fascinating and incredibly useful. Thank you so much again for contributing to the Separation Guide. I feel like we need to speak many, many times again, and hopefully we can. For those people who are listening to the Separation Guide, it's Jack Whelan, and I've been speaking with Tarnya Davis from NewPsych about how to speak with children when you are going through separation and divorce. Tarnya, again, thank you so much. There's so many useful insights in that what's been a very rapid 35 minutes. Thank you.
My absolute pleasure. And I will just finish with saying every person's different, every couple is different, every family is different. So this conversation, you might take bits and say, oh, that doesn't apply to me, it doesn't apply to me, but there might just be some little part of the way of thinking or dealing with your emotional reaction or your ability to settle your emotions so that you can do the best for your kids, that hopefully might make a difference for you.
Look, I think it's hard to put it all into one message. It is so complex. However, if having the children first is your true north, it's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank you.
Tarnya. Thank
See
you.
you.